What's up, guys? We're back with another educational video, and this week we are talking about training to failure. But first, make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment. Oh, the algorithm! This video comes about because there was a new study published. The first author on it is actually my coach for powerlifting, Zach Robinson. One of his other partners in his company, Data Driven Strength, Josh Pellin, also was on the paper. And it was examining the relationship between training to failure or proximity from failure and how that affects strength and hypertrophy. What was interesting about this study is they used a meta-regression, which basically, if you have enough data, you can kind of use it to project out and fit kind of a curve. Essentially, it can show you a graphic model of what the relationship appears to look like. And they found some really interesting results, and I think people have been misinterpreting them. So let's start with the strength data because it's a little bit more straightforward. And it may be a little bit counterintuitive to what you have come to believe. So what they found was that at a given load, training proximity to failure doesn't appear to matter that much. Why is that? That may seem odd. When you're training to failure or close to failure, you're going to have a lot of intraset fatigue. So as you approach failure, you're going to be more fatigued. It appears to be a relatively flat relationship between the proximity from failure and the effects on strength. Now, some people might say, well, then why ever train heavy? Well, you do need to train heavy if you want to get strong because strength expression is a specific skill. And training heavy helps with that skill. But let's look at, like, say, an RPE 8 single, which would also be an RIR of 2. So RIR and RPE are basically the same thing, but they're just inverse. So an RIR of 1 is an RPE of 9, RIR of 2, RPE 8, RIR 3, RPE 7, and so on and so forth. So when we look at like a single at an RPE 8 or RIR of 2, that means you could have done 3 reps with that weight. That is far less overall fatiguing than a set of 8 at an RIR of 2, meaning you could have done 10 total reps, but you would build up significantly more intraset fatigue going up to that number. And since it will have to be a lighter weight, you're probably not going to build as much strength doing that. And so I actually called Zach, who is my coach, to ask him about this study. And his words were that it appears that at a given load, it matters less how close you get to failure. But it is important to use heavy loads if you want to get strong. So let's take myself, for example. Let's say I'm going to do 20 total reps with 500 pounds on squat. Now, in a set, I could probably do sets of 5 that it's like an RPE 6 to 8. I could do it in 4 sets and get to 20 total reps, but I'd probably actually be better off doing like 10 sets of 2, as weird as that sounds, because I'm not going to have as much velocity loss. And when you lose velocity, you're actually decreasing the amount of force you apply to the bar. And since strength expression is how much force you can express, it's actually more specific to just do a few reps with a given load if your goal is to build strength. Now, it doesn't appear to be a huge difference in terms of like doing that versus doing, say, 4 sets of 5, but you probably are going to accumulate less intraset fatigue. If you're going to train close to failure and you want to build strength, your best bet is to do that at heavy loads. So heavy singles, heavy doubles, that sort of thing. If you're going to use a little bit lighter weights, you're probably better off backing off on the number of reps you do per set and just do more sets. They found something interesting when it came to hypertrophy, which typically what the recommendations have been is you don't need to train to failure, you just need to get close to failure. What they found with this model is it actually showed the best results with training to failure. And in fact, there seemed to be an inflection point around the RIR1, RIR2, where they started getting even better results than, say, RIR 3 or 4. Now, this has led people to say, see, you should take every single set to failure and anything else is a waste of time. That's not what this data says, and I asked Zach that exact question, And he said the first thing to understand is we had to estimate these RIRs and RPEs because in many of these studies, they weren't reported. So we were using things like velocity loss and other models in order to estimate the RIR. But in many of these studies, it was not directly measured. So that's one drawback of the study. It's not a knock on the study because it's a meta-analysis, meta-regression. You have to estimate these things if the authors didn't report them. Zach's words were, this has not completely changed my opinion on training to failure, but it has shifted it a little bit. So he said he does think it's important to get really close to failure, if not get to failure on occasion, but he doesn't think this data means you need to train to failure on every set. And there's a few different reasons for that. One, if you're training to failure on every set, it's going to be very fatiguing, difficult to recover from, and your subsequent sessions may not be good. Now, him and I discussed it, and we do think that this also applies exercise specificity, meaning if you're going to train to failure, you're better off doing that on things like say for lower body, leg extensions, leg curls, things that you can train to failure on every set, but it's not super fatiguing. Whereas when you start getting up into compound movements, training to absolute failure is going to be much more fatiguing overall. And the research data does suggest that on compound movements, because you can use an overall greater load, you can get similar or same benefits as training to failure while not training quite to failure. Now, what I will say is I think this data suggests that it probably is important to get close to failure. So Zach said, previously he would tell people, if you want hypertrophy, 2-3 RIR. Now he's saying, 0 to 2, right? So he shifted it a little bit up. I would say I still think if you're doing compound lifts, the vast majority, probably around an RIR of 2, maybe 1. If you're going to go really close to failure or to failure on a compound lift, make it your last set of that exercise. The other sets you can go kind of close, but on the last set, go to absolute failure if you want, because then you're not creating a bunch of fatigue on the front end that's going to negatively impact subsequent sets. When it comes to compound movements, maybe using failure a little bit more sparingly, saving it for the last set of a given exercise, and then saving most of your sets where you're training to failure for your isolation exercises. Now, I will say, people consistently underestimate their proximity to failure, or overestimate, depending on what way you look at it. Meaning, they will think they are much closer to failure than they really are. And people, by default, simply don't train hard enough. I will tell you, if you have never trained to absolute failure, where you literally cannot do another rep, you probably have no idea what it feels like. So I have done back squats until I've gotten stapled in a rack and had to dump the bar on the rack. I know what it feels like. One of my best squat for rep sets I ever did was I did 530 for a set of 9. And by the end, I was so fatigued that my bar sits a little bit lower on my right side than my left, and the hooks to re-rack the bar were relatively high for me, but I was able to unrack it no problem. I could not fully lock out my lumbar and get the right side of the bar back onto the rack once I was finished, and people had to run over and help me because I was shaking and about to drop the weight. Then I collapsed onto the ground and laid there for about 10 minutes after that set. That's training to failure. And people who say, stopping a few reps short is easy, the first rep of that set felt difficult. By rep 5, it was very, very hard. And then the last few reps, probably the last 2 reps, were extremely slow. Most people get to the point where it feels really uncomfortable. Maybe they would have done a few reps on that set and said, nope, I'm good. In fact, when they looked in a study and they asked people to tell the researchers how far from failure they were, but then the researchers then made them go to absolute failure, what they found is people were off by about 5, meaning they might have gotten to like the 9th rep and said, I have 1 more left. And then when they pushed them to failure, they did 15. So most people, unless you have trained to absolute failure, do not have a good idea of what that looks like. So what I will say is if you've never done that, you probably should do it on every single exercise that you do so you can understand what it feels like. But when it comes to actually developing a training program, if we're talking about big barbell free weight lifts, I think for the most part, you should probably stay at least 1 to 2 reps shy of failure. If you're going to approach failure closer, save it for your last set. On compound machine movements like a hack squat, a leg press, or a squat machine, probably can do more in that like 0 to 1, 2 RIR. But again, saving your failure set for your last set. But then on isolation stuff, knock yourself out. It's just not going to accumulate the same level of overall fatigue. That was the phone conversation I had with Zach. That is someone who competes in powerlifting, coaches powerlifting, and also does the research. I tend to take his opinion with a lot of weight. Overall, I think that's pretty much where my thoughts lie as well. I think the big take home is most people don't train hard enough. If your results are plateaued, it's less likely that you're overtrained, and it's probably more likely that you're not training hard enough. If this stuff seems really confusing to you and you really don't know how to implement it, that's why we created the Biolayne Workout Builder. So we take the guesswork out of reps, sets, RIR, and intensity, but we give you the freedom to choose exercises based on your preference and what you have access to. And we've grouped them in such a manner that you're not missing out on the benefits. So for example, we're not going to group like a back squat with a leg extension, because even though both work the quads, they are not both similar. We group exercises based on their similarities, so that, for example, like a leg press and a hack squat would be something that you could trade in and out because they're similar, they're machines, but they're both compound movements. So make sure you check out the Biolayne Workout Builder. It is a great value, only $12.99 per month. You get access to all of our evidence-based programming. If you want to get strong and get jacked, check out the Biolayne Workout Builder. Links in the description. All right, guys, if you liked the video, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll catch you next week.